Hello YouTube, welcome back to Nutkin Farm. I'm pointing out over the valley in the middle of my farm up towards the farmhouse in the distance, and I've got my new blocks in front of me, the MCT ones further on, and I've just mowed, thanks to the help of a neighbour's mower, my variety R block, and it's looking okay. A few trees leaning the wrong direction, which I can fix up a little bit soon, but I'm happy with their progress. What I'm not happy about, and partly what I'm going to talk to you about today, is some industry news that is quite concerning on the macadamia price front. Back in February, I lamented what I called a macadamia price crash, where the price had within a couple of years dropped from $6 a kilo, or even a little more, down to $3.80 a kilo for the biggest producer, Marquis, this year. I also did a video on the difference between notional and fixed pricing, and you can have a look at that separately. I won't rehash that, other than to say that a notional price is one that can be changed on the farmer on progress payments for their nuts, even after the processor has received the nuts. They can then actually legally decide later what to pay for them. Marquis came out with a letter on the 12th of October from the CEO to all its growers, and I've managed to get myself a copy of that. It's not a private document, so I can reveal its contents. What it said to growers is they said, well, look, we warned you in a meeting in August, which I did hear rumours about, that the notional price would not be met for this year, so that they were warning of a drop of $3.80. I'd heard rumours that they were talking about $3.60, which would only be a drop of about 20 cents a kilo. That turned out to be very untrue, because in this letter, the notional price has dropped from $3.80 to $2.90. Now, I didn't think I'd see a price with 2 in front of it. Even though I was a bit pessimistic about the price, I wasn't that pessimistic. But $2.90 is the new notional price, so any outstanding payments to Marquis growers for their crop for this year on their payment schedule will be made not at $3.80 but $2.90. And the letter also contained a warning that the market may deteriorate further, and if it does, the notional price will be reduced again. So that's quite awful. I mean, Marquis handles about 40% of Australia's macadamia nuts, so lots and lots of farmers go through Marquis, and they also do a lot in South Africa and other nut-producing countries. Well, first things first, why is it happening? And it's basically an exacerbation of the things I mentioned in my 2022 price bulletin, where we looked at things like increasing supply and reducing or static demand. Other rumours I heard were that China was finally becoming self-sufficient on macadamia nuts, which Marquis was very interested in supplying. They often supply nut in shell to China because the Chinese consumers like getting their own nuts out of the shell. We then, however, had a very big increase in the South African crop for this season, coming in 19% higher. And worldwide, the supply of macadamias actually increased about 21%, even though Australia dipped down a little bit. But frankly, the South Africans, as the largest supplier to the world market, when they go up 19%, and the macadamia market isn't a really huge market yet, that makes a very big difference on price, and that's why the Marquis CEO described it as deteriorating conditions. Now, anyone on a notional price with Marquis will obviously be cursing that notional price. Anyone who signed up on a fixed price will be breathing a sigh of relief for this year. I've just been paid my final shipment of crop by Wally's at $4 a kilo, and so I'm feeling lucky. But nobody, myself included, is insulated from world prices and the effect it will have next year. Come February or so, when the processors release their prices to the growers, we are all expecting a pretty unsavoury offering. And what do we do about that? Well, I've again addressed that in recent videos, so I don't want to bore you with it, but obviously you look at what you're spending on this year's crop. You don't put a Datsun budget into a Rolls-Royce crop if you're only going to be paid for a Datsun. So that's a problem. We look at how much we spray, how much we feed. Obviously you want to keep the trees in a position where they'll be able to perform again quickly when the price recovers. But for very many farmers, it won't be a profitable season, even if you get a bumper crop of nuts. And that's very disappointing, particularly if you depend on the income that these nuts provide you with. Longer term, of course, the lower price is scaring the get-rich-quick people out of the macadamia market. It never really was a kind of industry for get-rich-quick because, you've got to plant the trees and wait something like 6-7 years before you get a crop out of them. And that's always, I think, been a big contributor to the macadamia price going up and down, because the price goes up for a while, people plant a bunch of trees, their production eventually comes on stream and everyone's expecting these rivers of gold. But then, of course, the production shoots way up from all these new trees producing and the price goes back down again. And there has been a history of the big ups and the big downs. And, a lot of people thought that was over when we had about 5 years of increasing prices between about 2015 and 2020. Unfortunately, it's not over, and the mass plantings that have taken place even in Australia are going to feed into even bigger supply, which is going to have to generate even bigger demand for prices to even hold at this low level. And that's a little bit scary because, macadamias are one of those feel-good things that people eat when they're feeling rich and secure and they've got spare money after paying their mortgage. And, right around the world at the moment, the developed countries who eat macadamias might not feel too much like buying them, even if the price is lower. And I don't see the retail price getting lower, guys. So a little bit of a crunch there. What do you do longer term? Well, people won't be planting macadamias at that rate. I already heard from a couple of nursery people that orders are way down. The crop is much less fashionable. I don't know what else people are planting, but I'm sure there are plenty of other crops where the price isn't going down, or at least not by as much. One thing you can do, though, is if you are looking long term and you're looking past this current sort of multi-year price fluctuation, you could look at growing what the market wants most. And the market really likes what they call Style 0 and Style 1. These are actually defined by the United Nations, believe it or not. They're not just about world peace. They actually categorise food crops as well. And Style 0 in macadamias is large, round, whole nuts. Style 1 is still like 90% whole nuts, but you can tolerate a smaller size of those. And then the styles just go down to about Style 8. And by the time you get to Style 8, it's really just crumbs. But whole nuts are still selling well. These are the things that are on the bars of, rich hotels in Saudi Arabia. These are the ones that, in a bag of mixed nuts, people want to see whole nuts. Or in a bag of macadamia kernels, people would expect them to be, as much as possible, whole kernels. But some macadamias do better at producing whole kernels than others. And it's a little bit surprising that at least one of the new elite varieties that Hort Innovation have been recommending to growers has a very, very poor record of producing whole kernels. And I still think the time will come when nut processors will actually recognise the value of whole kernels in the prices they pay growers, because every time we get the sheet back from, CropWatch or whoever does our analysis of our crop, we get told what percentage whole kernel we've provided. And I'm running at about 34%, which, isn't great, but that's about what 344s produce, and much of my orchard is 344s. But I did some research and I looked at, okay, well, if you wanted to plant some macadamia trees for the purpose of generating whole kernels that are more valuable to the industry, if you want to supply what the market wants to buy, what would you grow if you're going after whole kernels? And like a good little barrister, I did my research and came across a number of studies and tests, including the regional variety trials, where the percentage of whole kernel was recorded in all the crops, all the various varieties of trees they were testing over several years. I started creating bands in which I thought, X percent would be good, X percent would be middling, and X percent would be poor. But then the circumstances varied so much between years. I realised, and I think the industry's realised, it's misleading to quote a certain percentage of whole kernels because they can just vary so much between climate, between year, all sorts of weather conditions, and we're not quite sure what weather conditions produce the best whole kernels. All we know with the regional variety trials was that 2016 was a great year for whole kernels for some reason. And so I did, tabulate across a bunch of years in this regional variety trials. I looked at South African data, I even looked at Hawaiian data, and came up with a list of the ones that you might consider growing and ones that you should probably not consider growing if you want to serve the market demands of the future. So I'm going to start with the bad ones, the ones that you should probably avoid planting in that particular market space. 741. It has a terrible performance on whole kernel in most years, sometimes under a third, well, often under a third, and the nuts are fairly small anyway, so they can't really get up into that style 0 rating. I suspect 660, which is closely genetically related to 741, is probably also poor on the whole kernel score, but I didn't get any proof of that. 344, as I mentioned earlier, is also one where there's really less than average whole kernel, and while you can get a large crop out of a 344, you don't really get what you need in terms of whole kernel. And then one of the new varieties, J. In some years, its whole kernel reporting in the regional variety trials was 16%, right? So, nice big nuts, really big nuts, but more than 4 out of 5 of them came out of the shell broken. And that's been promoted to farmers as an elite variety that we should grow. To me, that's just ignoring the marketplace. And you'd really want to, I'm growing a couple of J's myself for an experiment, but gosh, you wouldn't want to plant a paddock of them, in my opinion. Now we come to the list of good ones, and there are ones that are known to be really good and ones that are sort of more borderline, and I'll start with the ones that are known to be really good. Variety R, which is the one I've planted with an eye to the future, is very high in whole kernels. And in fact, in an early fact sheet back in 2016, Hort Innovation boasted that Variety R came in at 67.9% whole kernel. And it did for that year. But then you look at the wider data over the whole trial, and it came in more of an average of about 45%, which is still pretty good as an average. So the final fact sheet from Hort Innovation doesn't boast the 67%. It just says a high percentage of whole kernels. That is borne out by the data. It's worth growing. A38 has long been a high producer of whole kernels, and that's a very sustained performance over decades. You can trust that one to do well. 816 has a very high production of whole kernels when the tree performs. I know, people who grow variety 816. I won't be copying them. That tree is in terms of nutritional needs and fungus needs and everything else, very much a prima donna. It's also prone to stick tights, particularly in a low price market. It has to be treated very expensively, and it's not in this pricing environment a good variety to grow. Again, my opinion only. 849 is pretty good. The original 246 is pretty good. It can get 50% kernel in a lot of conditions. It's certainly a lot better than the 344. If you're looking on older varieties, 246 is worth considering. The descendant of 246, a variety called 835, which I'm growing some of in block 1, actually has the highest consistent percentage of whole kernel of any macadamia ever grown, and that includes variety R. It's consistently around 67 to 70%, and it's a fabulous performer on that. I don't think the nuts are overly large from what I'm reading in the data, but the percentage whole kernel is fabulous. There's a bunch of others that are sort of borderline and ones that you might not want to grow. Of the other new varieties, there's a new A variety, A422, from David Bell. That's quite good at whole kernels. It often produced around 50% in the regional variety trials. It wasn't an outstanding tree in other respects, but if you are growing for whole kernels, something worth considering. While we're on the topic of A varieties, the A16 is okay. The A16 is actually better than average on whole kernels. The A4 is not bad, but it's sort of more of a borderline case. And then there's some other varieties that are old and not being planted terribly much at the moment, although 842 is still being planted in Queensland. 842 is fairly good. H2, the rootstock we use, but there's some old orchards in New South Wales still growing H2. H2 has a very high proportion of whole kernels, and it's going to be valuable for that. And even the old variety 508, which was favoured in Hawaii, has a pretty good record as well on whole kernels as well. There are two other varieties, 781 and 783. 781, they're very different. Despite being close in number, 781 is susceptible to husk spot and it has a bunch of other problems and drops very late. 783 is husk spot tolerant, is a very heavy cropper, like 781, drops late but cleanly, and it's one that I've chosen for my pollinizer in my trial block, and very high in whole kernels, both of those. I would say the 783 is worth growing, not so much the 781. And but that's, again, a matter of opinion. So, guys, look, the news is bad on price. I've tried to include a positive element in this video because I have been accused of a little bit of doom and gloom, but when you see a price like $2.90, I'm not sure that there's a good way to interpret that if you're a macadamia farmer. By all means, if you're looking at this in 2022 and you're wondering what on earth to do this season, I think it's a mistake to neglect your trees entirely. I think you'd at least want to feed them so that, you've got yourself a working orchard that will produce a crop when the price recovers. But, in terms of spraying and in terms of how many harvests you do, because those are costly things, you might want to think very carefully about, how often you do those things, whether or not sprays are needed, what kind of inputs might be the cheapest way of keeping your trees healthy and keeping the soil healthy. And again, losing this concentration on getting the maximum possible number of nuts at any price and looking at efficiency, production per dollar spent. And those things may not necessarily give you a profit at a price like $2.90, but they will certainly help minimise your losses. That's enough from me for today. I hope you enjoyed the nice views of the farm, and I will be in touch with you again very soon. Bye for now.